the painting Panorama Europa was commissioned via the Glucksman Gallery in their work with the Jean Monnet Research Centre, and I was invited to participate in 2 creative workshops with participants invited via the Glucksman to respond to academic questions that had been posed by the Jean Monnet Research Centre in relation to EU integration, discrimination, human rights in Europe, in specifically Northern Ireland, Ukraine, and in relation to China. And from the material that we gathered from those creative workshops, then it was to, as such, go back to the studio to create a painting that reflected some of the responses that had come from that workshop. From the creative outputs from the workshop, which in its where collage works, which was a fantastic way for me to work, because as I mentioned, like in creating my paintings, I take images from different sources. So as a starting point for me, this was great to have like this source imagery, which I then went off to research further and get specific examples. I would usually start with a textured layer, which then I will then start building up the composition. As I mentioned, like the composition would have been like drawn out in my notebooks and rearranged. So I would have even from this initial workshop, I knew that that Europe was going to go in the centre as such, and that the rest of the composition would unfold from that. And while it is not a timeline, for me, there had to be kind of some sort of a reading of it that would go across, like in this panorama. And I'll speak a little bit about even the title as well. But I had like these initial images, and usually if I'm working on a piece of this scale, it would usually be over, like it could be over 2 years. So there was a time scale on this, so quite a short time scale. So I knew the initial images I was going to work with, which as I said was, say, Europe in the centre, and even from the idea of like my research into like that as a building, like why is this a hemicycle, and it's that idea of inclusivity, but also the building has recently been redesigned, and it's based on the Agora, which is in Greece. So it's nearly this idea of kind of Europe harping back to, you know, the ideal. And so even like in the placing of it, it's a glass building, so that idea of a panorama, but also could be seen nearly like a panopticon as well, so with like seen across Europe. But in response to, from like the participants and the conversations with them, where, as I've mentioned, like the participants saw Europe as something been, yes, in its ideals of having like a Charter of Human Rights, yes, it's great, but how relevant, or how does that touch on my life as a citizen living in Cork or living in Dublin, or anywhere in Europe? And there was Ukrainian participants in the initial workshop as well, and obviously they brought their perspective as people who had moved to Ireland and how they felt separated from their husbands or partners, and that idea of kind of, there was, and as you can see here in the lower left-hand side, this is the Ukrainian women and children separated from the war on the right-hand side. As the painting developed, so there's references to the north of Ireland, and as I said, through the workshop, a lot of the participants spoke about this idea of like, we've been looking at this for years, is this like, it's this cyclical nature of history, and that these images are familiar and maybe are not changing. There's art historical references. On my first visit to Cork for the first workshop, I visited the Crawford Gallery, and I came across this painting. It's a James Beale painting called Skellig Night on South Mall. And the painting depicts discrimination back in the 1800s. And for me, this was a very fitting for this to be included as what's termed a mise on a beam, so it's like a picture within a picture. And also the references to Sean Keating's painting on the lower left as well. So for me, this gave like a grounding to the painting of like being from the citizen's perspective, and in this case, it firmly roots it in Cork. The figure in the centre, and as I mentioned in painting, firstly initially with texture, I wanted to include somewhere this figure that had cropped up in a lot of the collages, a figure with their hands over their face, either like not knowing where they were going, but I wasn't sure how this would evolve in the painting, and it through like building up of the texture and then putting washes over, this figure began to emerge, and I was interested in how the figure actually appears to be going like backwards and maybe looking back over their shoulder towards Europe, and then maybe like a contemporary figure of justice as well. And even kind of referencing that idea of like justice is usually shown with a blindfold, which can be interpreted two ways. Either they are impartial because they can't, they're impartial by putting on the blindfold, but also are they blind to what is going on around. So then kind of the central area, as I said, like this kind of tower references Bruegel's Tower of Babel, based around the biblical myth of multiple communities trying to build a tower and then confounded to all areas of the world because they couldn't communicate. So this idea of this tower being kind of stable or unstable, is it being built, is it fragile, is it toppling? And then coming across to the right-hand side, which is more referencing the workshop, which was in relation to how Europe looks at human rights in China, or whether we ignore them, whether we acknowledge them. And from the workshop, a lot of the responses were around this idea of, well, yes, we know that there's these human rights going on, that are human rights abuses going on, but maybe we ignore them, or maybe they're clouded in, by the Chinese government, or so even in the way that the right-hand side is painted, it's painted more in a Chinese style of landscape painting, where there is no one-point perspective, and things are like nearly on top of each other, and more nearly kind of like watercolor, as we'll see in the top right-hand side. Just around the base of the figure, you notice on the right-hand side there's a reference to, and this came out of the first workshop, this idea of this like figure of, I suppose, horror or a figure in despair, is the Caravaggio's Medusa, which was initially painted on a shield. So for me, it felt relevant to include it. And as I was like painting over the summer of 2024, there was like instance that I like unfolding in both in the north of Ireland and the Straits of Dublin in relation to migrants, and so I included these. So there's nearly like a live feed of imagery coming into the painting. The format of the composition is nearly like this kind of zigzag, which for me kind of echoes the collage as well. The collages in that it's folding or unfolding, so nearly like a concertina. And maybe even questioning like this story as unfolding, but also what might be concealed in the folds. I suppose in the way that like the work was co-created in some ways by participants, obviously with myself as kind of bringing away that material, what I would hope is, and equally as the participants bravely brought their experiences to the workshops, that a viewer would have firstly engage with the work, spend time looking at it, and there's multiple entry points in the painting, and it's that idea of that it's open to interpretation. It's not hermetically sealed as this is a story, and because there is multiple narratives going on in it, I think it leaves that openness, and as such the work is only completed by a viewer interacting with it and finding their entry point as such into it, and then I suppose as such kind of weaving their way through it. But I think what I would hope is that viewers would come away with maybe more questions nearly than answers. And I suppose this is a work that is, it is a dialogue. It's an open narrative. So I would hope that viewers would take their own responses from it, and I look forward to those conversations with future audiences.